to allow a lot of students in who may not be as prepared for college as students at other institutions. And I wanted to stay focused on that because I think that teaching at an urban serving university like this already brings some complications with it, and some tensions that were there. And particularly when we look at students at urban serving campuses, these types of students require a more individualized approach to begin with, right? They need more services, and they need more attention in order to be successful. This, of course, runs counter to our neoliberal institutions who are sort of market driven and trying to streamline things in order to make higher profits. So what's ended up happening, and this probably isn't shocking to anybody who's watching this or sitting in this room, but any attempts to meet students' individual needs, right, are increasingly being placed squarely on the shoulders of the faculty, right, and without actually much additional support, which I'll talk about in a second. So I want to focus here really just to kind of elaborate a little bit on my experiences and then offer some bigger takeaways. And one of the things for me, that seemed to be very interesting about looking at this moment was I was a first-gen student myself. I taught I worked 3 jobs as an undergrad, certainly fit in the lower socioeconomic class. And I've been at the University of Washington, Tacoma for nearly 20 years. So I felt like I knew my student population and that I was addressing their needs and teaching to them. And then COVID happened and I found myself in their homes. And it really, and we all saw this, right? We are now in their actual living spaces. And it was interesting because it's not that I didn't know that my students had children, had jobs, had external factors, but to really see that right in front of me shifted a bit the way I was thinking about how I was engaging with them, right? It really forced me to think about how was I going to continue to develop, to deliver to them a quality education, but also recognize that their needs were very different, even from the needs that I had as a student, partly because we now don't ever get to shut off our lives. We can't step away from work. We can't step away from school. The computer is always there. And so that really made me start thinking about my own individual teaching, right? How was I going to adjust to help the students? And I did make some adjustments on the fly. I actually pulled a couple of weeks of work out of the quarter. This is always hard for us as instructors because everything we say is so important. But I did find that the students needed time to process, right? And I started that quickly with COVID, but realized actually I think they need more time to process, period. And so, I was able to shift and move some of that material out of their classes. I still have due dates, but I've started to frame those due dates as this is the last possible day it's due, but allowing them greater flexibility to turn things in over a period of time, but I get the grading back to them as they turn things in. So there were a couple of other modifications that I made, but that was my response to trying to reach the students in this online environment. I want to talk briefly about my university's response, though, because their response was a little bit different. Their response was to request that we offer, and I'll give just a couple of examples of what I thought was problematic about this, but their response really was that we develop individualized programs for each student, right? They wanted to maintain their student numbers, obviously. There was a lot of fear that students were going to drop out. And so we were being asked to, first we couldn't require students to show up for synchronous classes, which I understand our students have a lot of technology issues, but then we were being told that we needed to supply alternatives for those students and that they needed to be the same. They need to have the same education as the people who are showing up for class, which of course is not actually possible. They were also requesting, and again, they're not forcing, but the synchronous piece was, we could not require that. But there were some additional requests that came, like they wanted us to start instituting low stakes assignments during the first week so that students would feel engaged in the class, which I appreciate from a pedagogical perspective, except the workload on us became much more of a burden, particularly because, Randy, I might be wrong. If I'm wrong on the exact number of days, you can correct me, but I think students had till 10 days into our quarter to register for classes. So often the first week, students are still shuffling. Then now their assignments are late. You're trying to adjust for that. So at the end, and I'm keeping this rather general, I'm happy to talk more about it if people are interested, but the university's response really was that in order to meet student needs, that faculty would basically triple their workload. That's increasing into the fall, by the way. There's already been discussion that if we're in person, they're trying to figure out a way to require us to also offer an online version and also offer a hybrid version. That's now 3 preps for 1 class. So I'm going to jump ahead now to just sort of what I see are the two big issues that came out of this for me. One is the student part, and that is how do we find a way to balance maintaining scholarly rigor and academic rigor for our students while also recognizing that they have a lot of life issues that they're trying to balance in addition to us. So how do we make sure that we're actually delivering a quality education to our students at urban serving universities, right, without watering it down, but also with recognizing that they have different needs. And I have some ideas about that if you want to talk about it. But I think that's one of our big issues that came out of this COVID period. The second, I don't have any solutions for it, maybe some of you do, but it is this idea that we do need to find a way to somehow interrupt what I'm going to call a make work culture. I've stolen that from a colleague that we have in academia right now, and kind of maybe find a way to shift that to something that doesn't require us to be working, as I'm sure many of you do. I do 7 days a week, available now 24/7. I don't want to answer that because actually, the university systems, they like that, right? It works for them. It works at their level, but at a faculty level, I don't know how we interrupt that because it's how we get promoted. It's how we get tenured. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I did see that. Again, it was already there, but clearly exacerbated now as we moved through COVID all online, and now as we're moving to what's, I think, going to be a hybrid environment. That's my presentation, my thoughts. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Chris. I think looking through the program now, I believe next up is David Gracon from Gonzaga. David, you ready?
I am. And, I have a kind of just, it is summertime, so I have just a bunch of notes here that if it comes off a little scattered, I apologize. And thank you, Chris, for that wonderful presentation. So my presentation is called Will Zoom Fatigue Ever End? Where is this going? The future of Zoom. Is it going to go away? Is it going to remain with us indefinitely into the future? I think these are really important, vital questions to be asking as faculty members, but of course for our students. And so considering the future of Zoom in the neoliberal classroom. And I found 2 interesting quotes. Sorry, I'm just going to get my timer set here. From the Chronicle, recent essays that have been written about this that I think will help frame what I'll be talking about. And the first is an article called For College Finances, There's No Return to Normal. The critical problems facing higher education won't end with the pandemic. This was by Mark LeClaire on June 15th. And I think this is a really interesting quote. Strategic plans are critical, especially with the inevitable rise in online and hybrid education. The wholesale switch to online learning during the pandemic has resulted in a change in attitudes on the part of faculty and students towards what learning should look like, and the change is not wholly reversible. While a majority of students indicate that low-cost distance learning is inferior to in-class instruction, a sizable minority prefer its convenience. So I think that's something interesting to think about. Another related article by Lindsay Ellis on May 5th, 2021, at some colleges, remote work could be here to stay. And she claims at a town hall on April 14th, leaders at the University of California, Los Angeles discussed the possibility of filling some remote jobs with people who live out of state or even in another country. That could expand recruitment, said Levin, Associate Vice Chancellor for Human Resources, noting the high housing prices in LA. And then there's this interesting kind of competition that could be happening for faculty. Some campus leaders believe that flexible work from home policies will make or break their future hiring and retention efforts, particularly in competitive fields like technology. Campuses that don't embrace those policies may suffer, losing talent to other campuses in the private sector. So I thought these were some really interesting kind of current discussions about this. And I'll dive into some of my own personal reflections where I'm at, which is Gonzaga University, which is probably the polar opposite of Chris's campus. Now, I did work with Chris alongside a similar university to Tacoma, Eastern Illinois University, for 9 years, where I was tenured. Very similar situation. At least half our population was first gen. 1/3 of our students were African American. Now I'm at Gonzaga University in the Pacific Northwest. Extremely white campus. It's the least diverse campus I've ever been on. Upper middle class, I would say upper class students. It's a Jesuit Catholic, so there's a lot of emphasis on small class sizes. Personal attention is vital. So the cultures are very different. So I have very interesting insights into both worlds. Now, of course, teaching through Zoom had its pros and cons. Bringing guest speakers in, no doubt, was fantastic. I brought Victor Picard in with ease, and other speakers. So there's definitely some positives. Obviously not having to commute, positives for the environment with that. Teach from anywhere. There's a kind of geographical freedom, but of course that depended on intersections of race, class, and gender, and who's benefiting from these arrangements while others were not. This goes for both faculty and students. Of course, we had Zoom fatigue. I mean, even doing this presentation for me is a little painful because I've been off of Zoom for almost a month and a half. I'm like, oh my God, I'm back on. And this kind of like low-level anxiety is coming back. Maybe a little post-traumaticness there, if you will. The blurring of work in domestic space is, I think, a very problematic situation. You have a bad day at work on Zoom, you're in your home, you can't really escape this cycle of working and living. Technical glitches, of course, the digital divide was well amplified during the pandemic. But where are we going with this in the future? I'm really interested in this. 46% of Americans are fully vaccinated. Are Zoom hybrid classes going to stay? My sense at Gonzaga University is if it does stay, it's going to be more on the periphery or on the fringe. I don't think it's going to become the norm. I think the campus, partly because of the success of the basketball team, gets a significant amount of applications. I don't see that changing in any radical way. However, I did have an administrator say during the year, because they invested so much funds into all these technologies in the classroom, all these cameras, that perhaps it's here to stay, and we're going to start recruiting globally, and a student from China can get a Gonzaga University and never set foot on the campus. Now, this is met with a tremendous amount of resistance from the faculty. So there is this idea of close personal attention. We have small class sizes. But of course, then there's the economic realities that universities are facing to exist. And so where is that going in the future? So I would say at Gonzaga, I would say our next year or so, we're probably going to accommodate some remote students, but I don't think that's going to become the norm, unless I'm entirely wrong in reading into this situation in a very wrong manner. Let's see. Now, of course, there's all kinds of issues with, as Chris had alluded to, that if you're teaching most of your students face-to-face, and you have others who are hybrid, that's of course not the best situation for teaching. I think we tend to prefer teaching to our face, or we tend to prioritize them in the classroom. And then you're going to have students who are, and we're not trained how to do that effectively. And I think, especially going through all the training and learning all these new technologies, none of us have been compensated to do this. It's just something we had to do. We were forced to do. We really had no choice. So thinking about this into the future, but of course, Gonzaga is not representative of the 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. There's many universities, looking at community colleges who have been hit hardest by the pandemic. Their enrollments, how are they going to be impacted by this? More state institutions, how are they going to be impacted differently than an elite private institution? I think is really open for a lot of discussion. Of course, universities were in trouble before the pandemic started, right? We have the shelf coming, the demographic problem around 2026. There's going to be a huge shortage of students. We have a glut of colleges and universities in this country. That's going to be an extremely precarious situation. So how are universities going to adapt to accommodate a situation that was there long before, or has been anticipated long before the pandemic has arrived? Okay, so yeah, so I'm really interested in discussing this further. Where do we think this is going? How does this impact us as laborers at universities? How does this impact our students? And how does it impact the future of our profession? So thank you.
Thanks, David. Definitely some interesting questions. I'm already seeing some intersections between kind of what it is everybody had pitched initially for their ideas. So I believe I'm up next. Let me apologize for those who came in sort of after my initial apology. I'm at home in Texas in my parents' house dealing with some medical issues, and I sort of can't get a good unbacklit screen. So I'm gonna share a screen. So if you can let me know if you're able to see this, that would be great. Can somebody let me know if the screen is up?
We got it.
Perfect. Okay. So in case there's anybody in the room who doesn't know me, I did see there's somebody on their iPhone. My name is Randy Nichols. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm gonna turn the conversation a little bit. What I wanted to think about actually was the challenge that the pandemic presented to me in terms of trying to adapt my course, our introductory media studies course, into the guidelines of the pandemic. And the thing that was helpful to me was that just prior to the pandemic and leading right up into it, two colleagues of mine and I started to work on an open educational resource for this class. And we had kind of an unsuccessful attempt at that. I'll actually try to share the link for it as well for you. So if you look in the chat, well, I'll share it in the chat here in a moment. But the process of trying to create this open educational resource rather than using one of the standard introductory textbooks was really helpful for me in terms of making it through and adapting this introductory course. And the big challenge for me was one of the guidelines that we mentioned. This is something that Chris covered a little bit as she talked about the demographics of our population. One of the other things that was given to us as a idea was to try and essentially adopt a less is more approach, to actively cut content, to try and figure out what is the sort of bare bones skeleton of the class. And for me, at least, trying to think about how you cut back an introductory media studies course to something lesser was the hardest challenge of the pandemic. I taught a range of classes. I taught a production class. I taught an upper level political economy class. I taught a course in media policy. The hardest course for me to adapt was introductory, because the introductory class theoretically already is the bare bones. And so how do you cut it back even more? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to start with a question for all of you, something for you to kind of think about as you go through. What is it that you actually want your introductory class to do? And at UW Tacoma, we have a particular version of this, what it looks like. So here's our course description from the catalog. This course explores theoretical perspectives and core issues in the relationship between the media and society, including the production and reception of both news and entertainment. It evaluates the historical, cultural, political, and economic context of media industries, representation, and audiences. And again, this is supposed to be sort of the introductory level of all of these things, but look at how much is happening in this class. Now, one of the things that also happens in this class is that we are trying to teach them introductory research methods. A number of you have experience with the Oregon model, what used to be a course called information gathering. It was this kind of really famous model in US communication courses for a while. Oregon has since switched the way that course works. But the idea there is that we're essentially teach them how to find sources, how to evaluate sources, and how to put them together. So in addition to all the things you see here in this description, we are then trying to also teach them the basics of research methods. I should note as well that University of Washington, both Tacoma and Seattle, are on quarters. So all of this is happening in a 10-week quarter. and then the pandemic. So course objectives, I feel like I should put these up here just so someone somewhere will actually read them, because when you put them in your syllabus, the students glance over them. I tend to glance over them as well when I'm going through the syllabus. But again, you can see just how much is happening. So we want to explore several trends. We're not sure how many exactly in media ownership, technology, and production. Develop critical media literacy skills, think critically about media impact on culture, promote a better understanding of historical media development, and improve oral and written communication and research skills. So the challenge for me really was trying to think about what could I cut this class back to be? And the difficulty really became about trying to think of this through an OER framework. So open educational resources are essentially texts that make use of the various types of Creative Commons licenses to bring together resources for students into a dynamic text. And I'm now going to try and find the chat so I can actually give you the link here. So that should be the link actually to the, if it went through. I'm not sure if it did. Okay, hold on. Sorry about that. Give me just a minute. There we go. That should be a link to the OER that we actually came up with. And I should note that we actually ultimately decided, because we finished this OER in the first quarter of the pandemic, that we didn't like what this OER, we didn't like what the thing we put together did. The way in which OERs, at least the way in which we were drafting it, was we were going out and searching for other Creative Commons licenses textbooks. There's not a lot out there for media studies, for really any level of media studies. And so the idea of being able to sort of cobble together resources from other places became something of a challenge. Interestingly enough, to me, it was surprising that the thing that was hardest to find information on was the cultural studies framework. I found several articles that I thought did a really nice job for political economy, for cultural studies, and anything kind of in that more textual analysis, semiotic framework, anything in that sort of direction of communication studies. We couldn't find anything that we liked. The advantage we hoped was that this was going to be cheaper for our students, and I appreciate that Chris did a nice job actually of giving you a sense of who our students are. I will add to that. So, Chris noted that a significant portion of our students are first generation. Most of them are receiving financial aid. Most of our students are also working anywhere from 2 to 3 jobs outside of school. A ridiculous number of them are almost primary supporters for extended family. They have children, they have parents they're taking care of. We have a significant number of veterans. All of them, though, are the workingest of working class. This is one of the challenges that Chris alluded to in her presentation. One of the things that was really difficult, I think, in terms of adaptation, generally for us in the pandemic, was our students were the most essential of essential workers. Like, they all had to keep their jobs. They were all juggling their jobs. People lost their jobs because of the types of jobs they had. They were getting COVID. Family members were sick. Every challenge they could possibly have. This extends to them as well in terms of finances. So if you think about the cost of the introductory textbooks, which are usually, if you're lucky, you might be able to find a used copy in the $40 or $50 range. Finding an OER we thought was going to be a significant savings reduction for our students. And I think it's something that we're still kind of committed to. It also meant we were going to maybe be able to get more current examples. So the textbook that we currently use, Cruteau and Hoynes, has examples that are about 5 years old. And depending on this part of the student population we're dealing with, we also have a significant number of non-traditionally aged students who come in, as well as students who are coming in at the 18 and 19-year-old age. The examples themselves already feel dated. And so being able to pull stuff in that's relatively current, we thought was going to be more possible. And we were really excited that there's the possibility to customize this. So one of the things that is true for us, and I'm sure this is true for many of you as you are teaching these introductory courses, there are a range of professors teaching it, which means a range of approaches, a range of examples. We thought we'd be able to bring in some of our own individual examples. We were also really excited at the possibility of being able to have the class help us generate the text itself. So that's kind of the second step that we hope to get to when we come back to this. There were some reminders as I started to think about this for the class, though, and I wanted to kind of bring them back. The first one is that communication and media studies is more of a field than a discipline. So for all of you who have ever read the Fields and Frog Ponds debates from way back when, all the Oregon pro-sem people right now are currently holding their stomachs in pain. It's still true. We're still a field. we are as much political science and anthropology as we are literature and film studies. And that means that the basics has to cover this really broad range. And one of the things that we realized really early on in trying to generate the OER is that different faculty then are coming into this field from different perspectives. And we all, as we tend to do, cling to that perspective. I fought valiantly to make sure that we had a political economy chapter. One of our faculty members, insisted that the introductory class had to have a section on the environment. Depending on who is constituting this text and who is constituting the class, you're going to get different results. The other thing that I think is really important is, and we had to keep reminding ourselves of this, this wasn't just online teaching, it was online emergency remote teaching. And this has been one of the really frustrating things for me as the year has gone on, particularly in the last round of faculty meetings. Aaron, Rob, and I were talking about the way in which faculty have sort of become their own worst enemy in the pandemic. One of the ways that they've done so is they have begun to assume that actually, by virtue of having gone through this, we're now experts in online pedagogy. There's a big resistance, for example, from a number of faculty at our university at the notion that they should ever have to be certified in online teaching, that they should go through any kind of review, because, oh my God, we all did it for a year in the pandemic. And surely we did it well because we're teachers and we would never do anything bad. Most of us, and this is true for me, and I've taken some classes and some certifications in online teaching. I was at the very best a day ahead of my students. Sometimes we were building the plane as we flew it. And this was certainly true, I think, for all of us. So trying to remember that as we go through and think about this. To end, what I want to do is I want to reframe the question. And this was the thing that the OER taught me in terms of thinking about the class. And that was to, rather than think about what it was I wanted from our introductory class, what is it that our school students actually need? And as we're thinking about this class, as you're going through and coming out of the pandemic, I think this is offering us a really useful way to try and think about how to approach our classes in the future, maybe even a more useful way to approach things like assessment. Oftentimes, and UW Tacoma is better than any of the other schools I've taught at in terms of trying to put student success first and to filter things through student success. Even there, sometimes the notion of trying to think about what students actually need from a class comes up as a way to block decisions rather than a way to make them. And so one thing to think about that is to recognize the challenges they're facing and to try and think about how your class is going to actually help them with those challenges. In trying to think about what my introductory class at UW was going to teach, I had to think about something different than what the introductory class at Bentley University or at Niagara University when I taught there did, because these students are different. And I want the class to actually help them in some way. And that became the sort of guiding principle that I tried to think about in terms of revising the class. And then we can think about how that changes the resources that I want to use, right? Because so oftentimes the choices we make are about the examples we want to use because we like them, we know them well, we've prepped them, we've used them before. One of the things that became useful for me in the pandemic, and I would like to say that I always embrace this, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. One of the things that I had to embrace because of the nature of online emergency remote teaching was the idea that there was going to have to be risk almost every moment of class. We were going to have to try new things. I was going to have to try new things, and I had to be comfortable doing it. And one of the ways that happens was actually in terms of changing the resources that we used. And so what I'm hoping that we can kind of talk about is things that we should have learned from the pandemic that help us reframe the way we want to approach our classes. And I think the introductory class is a good model to start with. So the last things we want to then think about is obviously what kind of assignments we give them. And I think Chris alluded a little bit to the way in which we were given some guidance from the university about things we wanted to think about. That guidance was semi-helpful because it created new work, but it also didn't get into the realities of students, right? It was designed, so much of the feedback that I think that many of us got was designed to support the university's fear about losing students rather than thinking about what students would get from the class. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Next, we have Anis and Nicole, and I will stop my screen share.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can see everything that's on my screen. My colleague Anis, Rahman, and I are working on a new project titled Reproductions of the Walking Dead, Teaching and Parenting in Times of Crisis. Hopefully this will work. It worked when I tested it, but it's not working now. My apologies. I'm not really sure why it's not working. I'll heed any advice that others have for me because this works when I'm not on Zoom. Okay, well, we'll manually change them. It's not a big deal. Okay, what you see on the screen here is some of our work. Our work is similar to Chris, very preliminary. We're documenting our experience from March of 2020 to August of 2021 to show how we balance contingency teaching and parenting. And one of our goals here is to show the unsustainability of the gig academy and its harmful impacts on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Our marginalization situates along the line of race for Anise and gender for me, but we have relative privilege as a result of Anise's gender and my race, and by virtue of our heteronormativity of our families. Our project explores a lot of these areas, but today we're going to focus on our methodology, the parent trap, communicative labor, space-time labor, and oppression by the pedagogy, all resulting in the exploitive and stressful working conditions that we metaphorically argue are reproductions of the Walking Dead. I wish I knew how to fix this problem. I'm really sorry. So our research is a sequel to a project that we worked on with 2 other colleagues that explored the transition into emergency remote teaching in March of 2020. And the quote on the slide that you're seeing here is from our forthcoming article in Communication Education. And I like to ask, was emergency remote teaching this good for all of you? So both projects that we use are using critical autoethnography as our research method, performative writing, collaborative work to form a resistance to the gig academy. My work in this paper looks at gender, motherhood, and communicative labor. I write in the paper that my motherhood crashed into my teaching the moment I had my son. When a campus director flat out told me one semester that I should not have taken 1 semester off of teaching to have my child. After that incident, I tried to separate my teaching from my parenting. This leads into what I like to call the parent trap. Research clearly shows that motherhood negatively impacts a woman's position within the academy, and that gender disparity from parenting and unpaid care work is holding women back. Women's oppression is linked to the division of labor, socialization, and space. Throughout my career, I've experienced an inequality of space, a division of space, and in the pandemic, as all of you have mentioned, a collision of space. There's no separation. For me, teaching in times of crisis has meant exhaustion, additional care work, the insertion of my kids into my instruction, and an enormous amount of what I call communicative labor. The meta-theoretical argument around communicative labor shows how emotion, compassionate communication, and gendered work inform the experience of critical women scholars. Similarly, this also argues that communication itself, the very act of listening, speaking, and writing, is labor and is often shouldered by women within the academy. In the classroom, this meant referring more students than I can count to institutional support systems, and it's spending hours on Zoom so students could tell me about their problems that were almost never related to the classroom. Communicative labor foregrounded my teaching, both through my correspondence and pedagogical practices. I answered students by email and messaging apps between 6 in the morning and midnight, every day of the week, marking the always-on nature of pandemic teaching. Communicative labor was also in my pedagogy. I encouraged critical thinking skills, student-centered learning, and tried to foster interactive dialogical spaces. The 3rd-year class I taught in the fall learned about teaching for freedom and liberation. They curated media projects and designed workshops to educate publics and form collectivities. Yet, as Anise will soon discuss, performing these pedagogies can have an oppressive quality for the instructors who teach them.
Thank you, Nicole. And thanks for going through the trouble of presenting this slide. It did work in our rehearsal, didn't it? Yeah. Sorry about that, everyone. So your teaching pedagogy, it's resonated so well with Paulo Freire's classic work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, especially with his idea of dialogue, treating students with love, humility, care, and respecting their point of views. Now, acknowledging and accepting the needs for such pedagogy, especially in the time of crisis like this, I want to point towards the human cost of maintaining this communicative labor. We collectively argue that the digital turn in teaching pedagogy has decisive material, cultural, and psychological implications for the caregivers and parent teachers, not only due to the pandemic at large, but also due to the pre-existing gendered, parental, and racialized social relations that exist in the exploitative working condition at an increasingly neoliberal university. This has to do with the precarious nature of our contracts, despite our relative privileges. Take this for an example. For the last 6 years, I have taught every semester on part-time contracts before I could get the job I'm doing now, which is full-time, but is still contractual. I'm relatively more privileged than an Uber driver in New Zealand, a long-haul truck driver in India, or a migrant worker in Singapore. Yet, I share a thread of intersectional precarity with these workers as a laborer in the gig economy, as an immigrant, and as a person of color from the global South residing at the margin of the global North. However, what remains unseen behind this shiny transformation of my home office, as you can see in these images, is the political economy of online work and the ontological loss of what it means to be a domestically productive partner, a parent, or even a son. The online teaching space, especially that is shared with the home space of an instructor, it is shared, but it does not accommodate the conditions of a home and the family relation that exist within the home, which may involve giving childcare, elder care, disability care, as well as self-care. As this quote shows, how the class felt when my partially disabled, speech-disabled son came in the classroom, which is my home. In one hand, this made me feel uncomfortable as I just revealed my family vulnerability to my students, but in the other hand, it helped to connect with my students better. Despite the remoteness of our teaching, several students reached out to me saying they had similar conditions when they were a child. What remains also invisible, as you can see in this workspace, is the compromise in both parenting works and teaching works as a result of cohabitation of teaching space-time labor with parenting space-time labor. As this video revealed, I'm neither a so-called good parent nor a well-organized instructor. With a hope for keeping up my contractual jobs when I'm supposed to be spending time with my kids and performing domestic labors, I continue to work longer hours at night and during the afternoon. Also add to the fact that the loss of self-esteem and confidence due to not being able to meet any research deadlines, if you have some plan for that, as the online teaching demands more and more time away from research. This loss of researcher identity is our last observational point, but not the least. It is safe to assume that a large majority of caregiving academics are trapped in a vicious cycle. We can't do research because we don't have time. And we can't get hired as a tenure track because we don't have research. This often results in many mothers, especially single mothers and people of color, dropping out from academia altogether for not being stay competitive in research and publications. The same cycle occurs with the politics of grants, awards, recognition, and visibility. With few exceptions, Best teaching awards are usually reserved for the tenure stream. Now, where do we go from here? How can we be human again? Not just walking dead instructors. The solution, we argue, must be collective, if not individual.
First of all, parent instructors must have accommodations. Academic caregivers are burdened with childcare, homeschooling, elder care, in addition to student care. This must change.
My colleague at UW Seattle, Katie Pierce, among other scholars, pointed out in a recent work that we need to shift away from individual approaches to resilience, instead building organization and community resilience in academia. They argue, and we agree, that academia is in fact decades behind other sectors in family leave and accommodation policies.
For the sake of equity, diversity, and inclusion, academic leaders must begin reducing contingency in the gig academy, and administrators must consider how course evaluations, renewal systems, and promotions of caregivers can become more equitable.
In large structural sense, this also means that we need a welfare state that recognizes redistributive justice for its university employees. I think we can stop here and we look forward to further conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you both. That was great. Rounding out the roundtable panel, we've got Rachel Guldin from University of Oregon. Rachel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time today. I am glad to have you all here and to be in such great company. I do have to say, I feel like I'm not sure I'm adding anything new to what my colleagues have said previously, but I hope to add at least a little bit to the conversation. So my name is Rachel Guldin. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Oregon. And my presentation, or my little bit of the ramblings of my thoughts, are entitled COVID Classroom, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Disruption. So I start here with a Facebook post that I shared in March 2020, just a few days after finding out that I had a week to shift my in-person class to online instruction. I know this wasn't a unique experience, as so many profs and graduate students and instructors gave up their precious spring breaks and more to struggle through the shift to remote instruction. And I'll also acknowledge here that I am a childless white woman who is teaching in the academy with a fully funded doctorate. So I recognize there's a place of privilege from which I come from, which both I think to some degree exacerbated my stress, recognizing that I had this privilege, but also allowed me to do things that I'm not sure could occur in other classrooms over the course of the pandemic. So here we are in September 2020, when my summer course concluded, and I'm writing a missile of empathy straight into Canvas, which was the online learning management system that we used at University of Oregon. So what caused this shift between Kathy and here Rachel writing as Major Kong into Canvas? Now, I also want to note here that I understand the connotation of this image. It's militaristic and it's zealous and it's most obviously phallic. But in the spirit of culture jamming, I'm sticking with it to illustrate my experience during COVID of taking a wild ride through online teaching to infuse my course with empathy that's at the heart of critical feminist pedagogies. So I'd like to think through an autoethnographic reflection using critical feminist pedagogies as my framework. And I think critical feminist pedagogies are the perfect framework to teach during pandemics. And they're what I've used to kind of reflect on this experience. So I'll start with Bell Hooks's engaged pedagogy. In Teaching to Transgress, she wrote, "To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. In this approach to teaching and learning, students and teachers are treated as holistic beings. In essence, we are more than our roles in a classroom, and the lives, identities, and bodies we have outside the classroom continue to be part of us inside the classroom, and separating them is artificial and damaging. This foundational and essential, it's foundational and essential for learning and for vulnerability and for self-actualization to occur. The other framework that I used is Nell Nodding's ethic of care, which rejects an androcentric understanding of ethics that prioritizes justice and reason as universal. Instead, Noddings proposes that relationships and caring, which are traditionally feminine domains, are a social and moral responsibility, that we have an ethical imperative to care. An ethic of care demands that we care for ourselves, which enables us to care for others. In the context of education, this includes rejecting objective, dispassionate educational styles in favor of empathy, listening, and care, contextualized to students and their needs. In many ways, it asks us to reject the neoliberal university and engage in a more caring approach that doesn't always fit. I taught our information literacy and numeracy course in the spring and the summer. Both were taught in person previously, so this shift was the first to an online environment. My students in the spring had just moved to the online environment and were facing the trauma of that. And by the end of the term, they were surrounded by the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. My summer students were starting to feel Zoom fatigue after only 2 terms online. Little did they know what was to come with more and more terms online. The end of their course also coincided with the massive wildfires in the Pacific Northwest. Both terms for students, they found themselves dealing with the impending onslaught of 2020 election information. And oh, of course, in the middle of it all was a global fucking pandemic. Now, as you saw in that stressed Facebook post I shared earlier, I knew that at the start of this, I had to make some choices to make pandemic teaching tolerable. I have some personal history with stress regarding teaching, which I will be happy to share with others later. But that to say, I determined early on that I needed to release the characteristics of the before times, which really meant dismantling and dismissing the universality that to some degree is expected in the neoliberal classroom. And I had to start thinking contextually. So what did the course need? What did my students need? What did the moment need? And of course, what did I need? I started with what I needed. And this is that self-care that Hooks situates as a pillar of engaged pedagogy and is crucial in Nodding's ethic of care. I couldn't stomach the thought of lecturing 40 blacked out squares on Zoom 3 times per week. And I also knew that many of the instructors and professors at my institution had talked about how they were planning to lecture, just merely shifting their in-person model to the online environment, which if you know online pedagogy, that's not how it works. So at this point, I figured my students would be sick of being tethered to their laptops all the time, just to sit through droning lectures. So I broke the university's rules and their suggested pedagogical practices, and I built an asynchronous online flipped classroom. There were no required textbooks since cost and access were a concern without access to the library for reserved copies, which despite being a relatively well-resourced school, many of our students share that they actually need those reserved copies. All of the texts I required were PDFs or links that students could access through the course page. I pre-recorded my lectures. None of my lectures were longer than 2 15-minute videos per class. And I released them along with the readings to students a day ahead of the assigned class time. During scheduled class sessions, I posted students' daily assignments and held drop-in office hours. Anybody who needed support and a set work time or had questions could come to the Zoom room, but they weren't required to be there. The one thing I did require though was for students to have at least one 5 to 10 minute individual video chat with me in the first half of the course, so we knew each other by name and by face. As I got the term started, I tried my best to engage with the needs of the students. This included shifting to a more intentional use of discussion boards than I ever had before, because personally I hate them, but also participating in them and having conversations with students there. I also wrote some of the assignments to be more focused on application and personal choice than I'd ever done before, so students felt invested by applying their own professional and personal interests to the course theme and ideas. Another shift was in adjusting timelines for the class and for individuals who had issues that come up, like other courses having major due dates that coincided, or of course, students and family members getting sick with COVID. I got rid of late work penalties and instead asked students who missed assignments to give me a timeline that worked for them to turn in their assignments. The third big shift also was in assessments. I told the surveillance software companies to go kick rocks, and instead I used universal design for my exams. Exams became open notes, open books, and available for 24 hours without a time limit once they started. I encourage students to eat snacks, take a walk, and have a nap between answering questions. The first exam was all short answer and essay questions. And afterwards, students shared that they actually wished some of the short answer questions could be multiple choice so they could focus more of their energy on the essay responses. That's a fair critique, so I made the adjustment for the second exam, and it was very well received. One of the biggest adjustments was for the final. In each term, my students faced significant disruptions immediately preceding their finals. As I mentioned earlier, in the spring, it was the murder of George Floyd and the surrounding social unrest. And then in the summer, it was the climate crisis that manifested in the Pacific Northwest wildfires. In both cases, the ethic of care became the most important guiding factor in my pedagogy. How could I best care for the students in these moments? What was the best way to show that care? I made the final in both terms optional, so students who need it had it, and those who needed to put their energy elsewhere to respond to their material circumstances and their mental and physical health could. It's a choice I'll stand by as the caring choice until the actual end of time. So being out of the classroom forced me to think of students as holistic beings. And as a former elementary school teacher, my shift into the university environment has actually distanced me away from that. But this opportunity in the online environment during a pandemic meant that I was Zooming with them in their homes, at their jobs, from their patios, and from their apartments. And I saw more into their lives than a classroom would ever allow me to. Parents, siblings, and pets showed up in their video meetings with me. Homelessness and housing insecurity, joblessness, childcare, divorces and breakups, mental and physical health, and just general disappointment, which I think often doesn't get enough attention, all came up as issues that students faced in addition to a global fucking pandemic. Employing engaged pedagogy and an ethic of care meant embracing leniency. So you'll see that on screen, I'm indicating that flexibility and mellowing out allowed me to put together what I could do to care for my students. A typical part of my teaching philosophy used to be small failures now to avoid big failures later. And this feels really important when you teach in a professional school. I'd rather have an advertising student get an F with me when they miss a deadline and learn a lesson from that small failure than miss a deadline in their first employment and either lose an account or lose their job. But during the pandemic, when uncertainty was all around us, the lesson of care, both for my students and myself, felt more important than any lesson about deadlines. Students told me they engaged more and cared more about the course because they weren't stressed about it. They still learned, even without all those preconceived, rigid, and bureaucratic neoliberal ideas of what actually counts as education. In fact, quite a few told me they learned as much or more than their other more rigidly structured courses because of the flexibility that was designed into the course and that I provided to them. And maybe most importantly to me personally during these times was that students said they felt like they mattered and they appreciated some of the changes that situated them as people first. So a few slides ago, I said feminist pedagogies were perfect for pandemics. And here's the part where that asterisks come in, and I tell you that I think they're good for all the other times too. What lessons will I take along as we head back to in-person and hybrid teaching? Personally, I haven't felt so energized by teaching as when I got to see my students as holistic beings. Ditching rigidity in favor of care and heading into the term with the understanding that this was our first global pandemic together reduced the pressure and stress for both me and my students. And I was really upfront with them about that. asking for and actually implementing their feedback as we moved through the term was also valuable for seeing not only what they learned and hearing their thoughts, but also showing them that they were heard and their insights were valuable. I'll also take along my experiences with assessment. The absolute relief that students expressed to me and their confidence in taking a universal designed exam was more than enough to convince me to never do a timed in-class exam ever again. And increasing student choice in their assignments resulted in more flexible, meaningful, and authentic learning. The reality is that these classes were taxing and exhausting. And truth be told, the amount of time and energy I put into these courses is not sustainable, realistic, or feasible for somebody who's teaching 4 or 5 classes per term. I had one class, I'm childless, and I'm a graduate student. And it was exhausting for me. But I bring these things up because I want to take them forward because they represent the opportunity, the challenge of post-pandemic pedagogy presents, and which must be addressed at both educator and institutional levels. Based on my experience, I believe educators and higher education institutions making a shift to engaged pedagogy and an ethic of care can have liberatory potential as we return to that in-person instruction. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Rachel. That was awesome. We have about 38 minutes for questions and conversation. I'm going to ask Rob to stop the recording so we can have maybe some more honest and open conversations